Welcome back to part 2 of our Tiffany Thomas sew-along. In this lesson we're going to talk about collars and Peter Pan collars specifically. If you have a well-drafted and well-stitched Peter Pan collar, it is going to meet in both the front as well as in the back if it's buttoned in the back. Excuse the wrinkles, these just came out of the closet. But that is a correctly stitched and correctly drafted collar. It doesn't matter if your collar has a lace application. In this instance, this buttons up the front. It still needs to have the lace meeting at the center front. This is the one-piece collar, so I don't have the separate pieces, but if I did, the lace would also meet in the back exactly the same, with the lace touching each other, not overlapping. That would be a correctly drafted and stitched Peter Pan collar. In this case, I'm using this is a different pattern, but I have a 1/4 inch Swiss trim, and again, it meets in the center front, and when it buttons, it meets in the center back. So you can see that that is how a correctly drafted pattern is drafted and sewn. I frequently see, when I look on the internet, instances where collars don't match, and rather than point fingers at anyone at the internet, I pulled out something that I made probably 30 some years ago, and it's got a narrow Swiss trim which does meet in the front, but when you turn it over you can see this is a miss. So I have not pulled out this pattern. I'm not even sure what pattern I made to see if the collar was drafted incorrectly or if it was just my ignorance at the time as I was newer to heirloom sewing. But I suspect that perhaps this collar was designed for a 1/2 inch lace trim, and I just used a 1/4 inch and then made it meet up in the front, which meant that it does not meet up in the back. So whenever you see something like this, this is a mistake, and it just screams of a mistake. Or if you see lace that's overlapping in the front or squished up in the back, your lace needs to be like this one. It needs to meet in the front and in the back. And all Peter Pan collars should meet both in the front and the back and not miss in either one of those places, because that is just an obvious mistake, whether it's a pattern draft or the mistake on the part of the seamstress in ensuring that your seam allowance is exactly correct, or that you've trimmed away or for the lace or whatever. Now, in the first video, I incorrectly stated that you would have to remove both the amount of the lace and the entredeux, which I used an example of 1/2 inch lace plus the entredeux, so you would be removing 5/8 of an inch. That is actually incorrect, because this pattern was designed for piping, and you can see that piping and entredeux are about the same width. So you really only need to remove the amount of the lace if you're doing the Peter Pan collar or the one-piece collar with lace. So the way to do that is to take your pattern piece and mark on it the width of the lace, and do that for the front and the back. Put a little mark at the width of the lace, because sometimes a 1/2 inch lace is slightly less than a 1/2 inch, sometimes it's slightly more. That's how much you need to remove from the pattern piece in order to have your lace fit correctly on the pattern. And then you can take your French curve and you just Find where it looks pleasing to you and redraw that curve for the front and the back of the collar. And it usually takes a couple. You want it to be a smooth, you can freehand this in if you like, but I think using the French curve gives a prettier shape to your collar. And if you want to remove some from the outside edge, you could, but I wouldn't remove too much. I did not remove any from the outside edge on this collar, and I think it's still a nice width for the collar. So that is my tips for your collars, and we will get on with actually sewing it. So you can see I have my collar that's been traced out and marked, and I have taken my glue basted, which is a temporary water-soluble basting glue, and I have put little dots of glue all around the outside edge of both collar pieces. You can just stitch your piping on if you're very confident in your sewing skills, but I find that using the glue basted, you will get the most accurate result. I'm going to begin placing my piping along this collar edge, and I'm going to switch to my padded surface so that I can pin this in place for the time that it dries. So hopefully I've got this in okay. So I'm just going to stick a pin in to keep this in place while it dries. And you want to align the outside edge of the piping with the blue mark, because the blue mark is your cutting line. And thankfully, piping has a lot of stretch to it, so it will curve nicely around the outside edge of the collar here. So hopefully you can see that I've got this cut edge following that blue line where I've traced the collar shape. And you're going to do this to both collar pieces and then allow it to dry. So there you go. That just takes a minute to shape this. And if you need to adjust anything, you can do that. And if you have kept this outer edge of the piping exactly on that traced line of your collar shape, and you've been accurate in your tracing of the collar shape, your collar will have a beautiful shape to it, and both collar pieces will come out identical. I was careful to use glass head pins here when I was pinning this down. That way I can use my iron to help the glue dry a little more quickly, and I don't have to worry about the pin heads melting into the fabric, which is a real issue if you've used plastic head pins. The glue has dried, so I'm now ready to start stitching my piping to the fabric. So I'm using my zipper foot for this, but you can use whatever foot you have decided works best for you and get that piping stitched to the collar. I do move the needle over one more click to the left so that it's a little closer to the piping, but again, not as close as possible, because when I sew the under collar onto the collar, I want to get even closer. And I've shortened my stitch length to a 2.0. I also like to use the needle down position for this, or if you have the option of having the needle down and it raising just slightly as you pivot around a corner, that's a good choice as well. but you just want to get one thread closer to the cording than the previous stitching. I'm not sure if you can tell, but you can see where this second row of stitching where I've attached the piping is slightly closer to the cording than the previous row of stitching. Now I am ready to apply the under collar. Because this collar has a design on it and I don't want that same design shadowing through to the front side of it, I've chosen to use just a solid white batiste for the under collar, or the collar facing, whatever you want to call it. And so now you can pin these two pieces together around, all around the collar. And actually I'm going to pin from the other side because that's the side we'll be sewing from. So I'm going to pin around here. And if you're doing the one-piece collar, the process is exactly the same. You just have one collar piece that you're sewing around. I've chosen the Peter Pan collar, so obviously I have two pieces that I'm sewing around. And if you're doing the Peter Pan collar with the two pieces, after you get this pinned, you can at that point separate this into two separate blocks. You're still working in a block, but you've separated them. It's just a little easier to work with the two pieces cut apart, I find. For stitching the under collar onto the collar, I am going to use the previous stitching line as my guide. And I've moved my needle over yet another click to the left so that I will get even just a little bit closer to the piping than the previous stitching. And this time I'm going to make sure that I back stitch at the start of the collar, because when you turn it, you don't want those stitching lines to come loose. Okay, that looks pretty good. What I tend to do after I have stitched this on is view it from the side that the facing side, because that's just one thin layer of fabric, and you can see if there's areas where you need to get closer. And again, you can use this row of thread as your guide. And if you found, like right here, I can tell that's not quite even, so I'm going to go back. And you can go back and stitch as many times as you need to until you get perfectly, until your stitching line is perfectly even around the piping. Once you've finished stitching and you're happy with how it looks, and again, I tend to hold it up to the light or to a window to ensure that I think that the piping looks exactly even all the way around this, you know, how the distance that I've stitched from it. Then you're ready to trim your collar. And I trim it about, well, I would say maybe 1/8 of an inch away from the stitching line all the way around the collar. If you trim it that close, there's no need to clip any seams like we normally have to clip around curves. And if you've stitched it a couple times, there's no way that this fabric is going to fray away. so you don't have to worry about that. Okay, so I've cut around. Now we're ready to turn the collar right side out, and then the neck edge can be trimmed away. Okay, so I'm happy with how that looks. If there were still areas I felt like needed to be addressed, I would go back, turn it right side, or turn it inside out another time, and I would stitch again, but I'm happy with that, so I'm going to leave it at that. And then I am going to cut along the neckline edge here through both the collar and the facing. And remember, your blue line is your cutting line. So with that cut, hopefully I haven't caught the cording, but at this juncture I like to pull out the cording, if I can, from the seam allowance, and you want to cut out, okay, there we go. So I want to pull out my 1/4 inch seam allowance and cut that away from both the front and the back edge of the collar, because that will reduce the bulk in the neckline seam when you go to stitch that. So I have pressed this collar, and I will repeat all of this for the other collar since I'm doing the Peter Pan collar with the 2 pieces. But the next thing I want to address is how the collar rolls over onto the front of the garment. If you've ever used any vintage patterns, you will frequently find that there is a collar piece for the collar and then a separate piece for the under collar or the collar facing. It can be called either one of those. And the under collar will be about 1/16 of an inch smaller all the way around than the actual collar piece, but yet you still match up the cut edges. So you're matching a slightly larger collar to a slightly smaller collar. And what that does is it helps the collar roll over a little bit. The way we can accomplish that same effect with our collars cut the same size is to push out just a slight, maybe 1/16 of an inch at the neckline edge here and pin this in place. And I do that along the collar. Obviously you'll have to taper off as you get to the seam here at the center front and the center back. But by doing that, that will aid the collar in having a pretty roll, and it also helps prevent that situation where a collar flips up in the front when the baby's wearing it. So I pin this all around, just slightly, as I said, a slight 1/16 of an inch away. Hopefully you can see where that is. There's a diagram of that in your sewing notes. And you can see this, that way, when it rolls over, it's a physics thing. The collar on top covers a little bit more area than the collar underneath. So with that pinned in place, I'm going to go and stitch at about 1/8 of an inch just to hold that in place. And then after I've stitched that, I'm going to trim away that little portion that peeks out. So both collars are stitched, and I've basted both of them together at the neck edge and trimmed away that little excess fabric that was peeking out. The last step here is to put a mark on each of the collar fronts for the view that I'm making. If your shirt opens in the front, then you would put those dots at the center back of the collar, but you want to put a little dot at the 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then you can either by hand or by machine tack these together. So I usually do that by machine, and I do it just inside the blue mark with a zigzag stitch so that they won't come apart then when you're attaching it to the blouse or the top. So I set it for a wide zigzag, and I make the setting so that it doesn't go forward at all, it's stationary. And then you just want to keep those two pieces together at the blue mark and zigzag back and forth a couple times. And there you go. This way, whether you do it by hand or by machine, when you pin it to the top of the blouse, that there's no chance that it's going to come open. And you want your collars to always meet at the center front and at the center back. And they meet at the center back of this. Once it's sewn in and the buttons are on, the collars will still meet at the center back. Collars, unless it's a design feature, they are made to meet at the center front and at the center back. So now that this collar's done, we're going to set it aside until we need to attach it to the top.